Hey, Danny, I don't know how you do it. Yeah, it was really shocking how many people showed up last night, isn't it? And how well it's done today as well. Finger Lakes, that would be a nice place to be. Denver, two from Colorado right next to each other. Minneapolis, that's such a nice town. Pennsylvania, you know what you have? You have a really good system of buses as well as everything else. Champaign, Urbana, my uncle made a bunch of buildings down there. Albuquerque, Duluth. Stone Mountain, Georgia, man, that's a historic town. Um, Sunny California. It's hot here. It's really hot here, but I know we have no monopoly on that. Well, people are coming in, and I know I'm late today. I had to turn in the final draft of the afterword for the paperback edition of Democracy Awakening at 5 o'clock, and today was just one of those days where there was way too much stuff to do, so that's why I got pushed back. But while you're filing in, let me answer some of the easy questions that you asked about. And the first was Nancy wanted to know why I don't have a Maine accent. And the answer to that is, although Wikipedia says I was born in Maine, I was not. I was born in Illinois, and I learned to speak in Illinois. And then we moved here. So whatever vestiges I had of an Illinois accent got wiped out when I moved to Maine. So all of my siblings and I speak with very nondescript accents. And then our mother had a New England accent, and our father had a deep Southern accent. So they all kind of worked out in a melting pot here. So that's the answer to it. And I was not born in Maine. My mother was from Maine, and then of course we ended up here permanently, and her family was from Maine. But we actually, all of my siblings and I were actually born outside of Chicago. All right. You could hear right there, Chicago, right? Instead of Chicago, which is what people would say in Maine. All right, so here's another question. Now that enough people are here that I should get going. People have asked whether or not I think Biden has Parkinson's. And I want to answer that, first of all, by saying, not a doctor, at least not a medical doctor. If Biden has a question about or says something about the American Revolution and you want to know if he's right or not, I'm your girl. But in terms of his medical diagnoses, I got nothing. And I got nothing on anyone, by the way. So there's certainly reasons to suspect that former President Trump has medical issues as well. For one thing, he can't stay awake, even in his own trial and yesterday at the Republican National Convention. But I don't have any idea what any of that might be. But this is important. In February, and I'm afraid off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact date, but in February of 2024, when Biden had his annual physical, there was a very complete workup of him in all kinds of different ways. And one of the people who examined him was a neurologist. And that neurologist gave a report, and then it was given to the press by the White House physician. That's not the actual title, I don't think, but that's the guy's position. Now, in a really weird series of circumstances, I've actually met him a number of times. Mostly because we're sort of around things, but not in the center of things. And I will tell you, he's a real straight shooter, and he is very, very, very principled. I liked him a lot, and he would not lie. I'm more than happy to say that this man would not lie. In that workup, he said that Biden had been tested for all of that. Stroke, I mean, I don't know what they all are because I'm not a doctor, but Parkinson's, strokes, whatever other things there are. I wrote about this in one of my letters, and it's in a number of other places if you're interested. You can even just Google what the Biden's February 2024 medical report, and it will come up. But in that, the doctors and the neurologists said, no, he does not have Parkinson's. He does not have any neurological symptoms. What he does have is it neuropathy? I don't even know what these things are in his feet, which makes it hard for him to walk easily. But that has nothing to do with any kind of a neurological disorder that would affect the way he behaves. So that's all I got. And that's very much out there. It is interesting that we have nothing at all on Trump. Remember, his doctors, when they reported his physical, said he is the strongest and the fastest and the best, and he's going to live for 200 years. That's not really helpful. So, one of the things that you're seeing a lot in the media right now is because Biden is willing to adhere to the norms of the presidency, which is that you release your physical and you tell people about your medical history, that he gets a lot of grief over it. Trump just says, I ain't doing it. And nobody hounds him about it. So that's the best I got on that particular question. All right, so getting into some of the specific things you asked about. First on everybody's mind appears to have been the shooting of last weekend, which I think was Saturday. And once again, really keen to urge you here, we don't know that much about it. We do not know that much about it. There is an investigation going into it right now, and that's not necessarily a conspiracy. Think about how hard it is to figure out exactly who was doing what. And I'm going to actually do a little bit of a deep dive here because I'm a nerd. And that is, if you think about ballistics and understanding how to reconstruct what happened, you probably don't know where the history of that came from. And if anybody is in Las Vegas, there's a museum in Las Vegas called the Mob Museum. And the reason that we have the whole modern science of forensics for reconstructing crime scenes is because after the St. Valentine's Day massacre of the mob in the 1920s, one of the police officers who was there, he wasn't literally there, who was trying to recreate what happened, recognized that because of the way that the mobsters were lined up against the wall and the bullet holes in the wall, that you could recreate who was standing where. So he took down all the pieces of that crime scene and began to study them. And then at some point had a falling out with his department and ended up sort of taking everything home. And the Mob Museum acquired it. And you can see this now. And you can actually go to the Mob Museum and see how this guy lined up the bullets and the bullet holes and the bodies and all that to figure out what was happening. I know that was a rabbit hole, but I thought it was really cool. All right. So in the case of what happened on Saturday, they're still reconstructing it. And it's going to take a long time. That being said, there are some things that are unusual about it. And I'm not going to speculate on absolutely anything because we don't know. And remember, one of the absolute things always to remember in our lives is that if somebody is asking you to respond to something instantly, either something on your phone, something on your computer, or something in the news, it's a bad idea to do it. They are almost certainly feeding you something that is incorrect. They're either scamming you, they're trying to frighten you, or in the case of the news, they're trying to get your eyeballs. So you may or may not have noticed, I did not post anything on Sunday until I posted that letter quite late. And I did that very deliberately because there were all those rumors flying and I didn't want to be part of that. I wanted to model that you got to take a deep breath and stop playing that game because all it does is it upsets people and it exchanges a bunch of really bad information. What we know so far is that the shooter appears to have been, and again, people get mad when I say things like that or allegedly or whatever. That's because there is a system in place for what those words mean. It certainly looks as if this man was the shooter, but it hasn't been tested by anything. All we have seen is what's in the news media. So it appears that the shooter was this 20-year-old young man and that he appears to have used an AR style weapon, an AR-15 style weapon that apparently his father had purchased legally. He was also a registered Republican and he had Trump signs in front of his house. So that complicates the kind of messaging that the Republicans were doing after the shooting right there. So I'm going to say more about the shooting and what those implications are in a second, but there are some things that jump out as being unusual. You asked why Trump had lost his shoes. It's pretty clear that he wears lifts in his shoes, and there's actually a video where you can see a shoe being thrown off the platform, and it appears that a lift is coming out of it. He seems to have lost his shoes when he was being forced down on the ground or being forced lower by the Secret Service. So that's what was going on with that. There is also something really interesting about Trump's injuries, because if in fact this man had an AR style weapon, that's an Armalite style weapon, the injuries from that kind of weapon are really devastating. And we have not seen any official report, any medical report of what happened to Trump. So if you think about what I just said about Biden and this very detailed report, Trump is the one who said he got shot. There has been no official confirmation of that, and there may never be because of the regulations that say that doctors can't talk to the public about other people's medical history. But it is interesting that that has not happened, and that, you know, some of the news stations are kind of like, hey, come on here, folks. But there has not been a lot of pushback on that. And like I say, I'm very skeptical of anything anybody says unless there is independent corroboration. So the fact that all we have is Trump's word for the fact he was shot and that he is a notorious liar makes me feel like I would like to see some other confirmation of where his injury came from. Now, the day after, on Sunday, he golfed all day without a bandage. And then, of course, last night he showed up at the RNC with quite a heavy bandage. I am not a doctor. I don't know what's going on there. But that's all funny to me. Not funny, haha, but it's unusual about that as well. So the other question you asked about that shooting is, what would it do to the election? And first of all, this is a wild card election. Nobody can predict the future. But my guess is not a lot. That was the timing of that. If you thought about the thing that was going to happen most quickly in American politics anyway, it was the Republican National Convention. And the idea that an assassination attempt, not a successful one, but an attempt, if it was that, again, that's me speaking, I'm not a forensic scientist. Sure looked like it, but who knows? The idea that that would have an effect almost 4 months out or however many months out we are, maybe. But I don't think so, especially not with as many questions as there have been around this particular event. So I'm trying to be careful here, but it was weird. You know, it's one of those, you've probably heard me say that, that I watch history, I watch the news all the time, and most of it, to me, looks like cement coming out of a cement mixer. And if you've ever done that, you know, it's kind of repetitive and it's kind of mesmerizing. But if all of a sudden you saw a plastic child's dump truck in that, you would sit up and take notice and go, wait a minute, there's a story here. I got to figure out why there's a plastic dump truck in this stream of cement. I literally wrote to somebody that night and said, this is a child's plastic toy. I don't understand what's happened. We don't have the answers yet. But it's a little odd. Something feels odd about that. So that's all I've got on that particular shooting. I would say, you know, we all want answers instantly and we don't get them instantly. So let me step back a little bit from that and lay out a much bigger question. And that is in this moment. And that is that, let's think about that Republican National Convention that is currently happening between Monday and Thursday of this week in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And one of the things that really jumps out to somebody like me when you're looking at politics is that people around the country have been tending to look at Trump as if he was this all-conquering, all-powerful leader. And one of the things that people like me looked at was, we said, you know, you can say that, but Trump hasn't really been seen since 2016. He's been really tightly wrapped since 2016. That is when he was in the White House. Basically, they kept him pretty tightly wrapped. During COVID, he would hold press conferences, but if you recall, they were such a disaster that after he suggested injecting disinfectant in people or shining lights into them, they had him stop doing those. And and after that, after 2021, he saw people at Mar-a-Lago, which is a very closed system for him. It's his friends, it's his supporters, or he went occasionally, very occasionally, to rallies. Now, if you're watching those rallies, they were not the ones that he had in 2015. That is, I've said this before, Trump is really good with an audience. You know, people don't like to hear that, but he used to be really good with an audience, he was a really good orator. He doesn't have that anymore. Since the 2021, he didn't really fire up the audience so much as just complain about how badly he had been treated, and it was boring. He went on too long, and it wasn't turning people out. What also has happened since actually before 2021, a little bit before that, is that Rush Limbaugh died. And the Fox News channel got sued for over $700 million for lying about election interference. And what those two things did is they ceased to give the Republican Party marching orders. So if you think about Rush Limbaugh was so effective in the 1990s that an incoming Republican congressional majority actually made him an honorary member of that class of Congress critters going into office. And if he said this was going to happen, that's what happened down the line. Now, a lot of people have tried to pick up that mantle. Charlie Kirk has tried to, of Turning Points, USA or whatever it's called. Certainly Steve Bannon has tried to pick it up. Some other major figures on the right have tried to pick that up. But there hasn't really been that lockstep. And what's happened with the breakdown of that lockstep and with the extremism of Trump and his people is that the Republican Party has a serious civil war going on right now. So if you think about the Republican primaries, about 20%, give or take, and mostly take, because in some places it was as high as 26% of primary voters, that is the most fervent, committed members of the party, did not back Donald Trump. They voted for Nikki Haley. And that doesn't necessarily mean they supported Nikki Haley. It meant they didn't like Trump. They thought he was too extreme. They didn't like the positions he was taking. So that's 20% of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party ain't that huge, people. So that's 20% of the Republican Party that's like, we don't want that guy. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to come around to vote for him later, but it does mean they're wavering about him. They could stay home. They could vote Democratic. They could vote for a third party. They could do any number of things. And those people tend to be women, often people in the suburbs, and also men in the suburbs, but people who just want to go about their lives. Leave me alone. Stay out of my face. Let me go along with my life. I want my kids in decent schools. I want to be able to put food on the table. Leave me alone. And you know what they care a lot about? Abortion rights. All right, so there's that 20%, and then there's the Trumpers. They're just the Trumpers. But lots of people have not been paying attention to the fact that the far right, the white nationalists, the people who are determined to march at the head of a Christian army and restore white nationalism to what they consider the foundation of America, they have been saying now for months that Trump has gone too moderate, that he is that he is being controlled, and I'm not actually going to use the epithets that they have used, but he's being controlled by other people, including members of the deep state, but there's racial groups that they say in there. And they were really angry about that, and they were really pushing for the installation of somebody like Mike Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, into the vice presidential slot. So going into this Republican National Convention, there's Trump, and he had left his declaration of who was going to be his vice presidential candidate really late. It's not since 1988 that we had on the Republican side somebody not announced until the convention. And he might have done that for many reasons. He might have done that because he really wanted to have that boost. He told one news outlet that it was kind of like The Apprentice. He thought it would get better ratings if he announced it then. But also, by not saying who he was going to pick, he shut all those people up. They weren't going to criticize him because a lot of them were kind of hoping that they would come on board. But by announcing as late as he did, which was yesterday, and then announcing J.D. Vance, and I'll tell you more about him in a second, he has really alienated those 20% of people who thought he was too extreme, and the people on the other end who thought that they wanted somebody who was a white nationalist. J.D. Vance's wife is of Indian extraction or is Indian, I don't know which, and his children are biracial, and they are rabid about the tapping of him to be the vice president, because they're like, what about us white nationalists? What that's going to mean about them getting on board, who knows? But so what you are seeing going into this convention is the attempt really to make it look like Trump is a conquering hero. This was to be his big, party back on the national stage. And what they got instead was, of course, Trump falling asleep there last night, and the teleprompter's not working, and not many people have gone. The businesses in Milwaukee are really unhappy because they're empty, essentially. And then on top of that, this announcement of J.D. Vance is far from uniting the party, which is what they had talked about after the shooting. J.D. Vance has openly called for abortion with no exceptions, including for incest or rape. He has said that people should stay in abusive marriages because it's better for the children. And he has at least one comment about women who operate in the public sphere as being something like angry cat ladies that want to make the rest of us as miserable as they are. And that's really not going to play very well with people who were concerned about abortion bans, especially, and who were concerned about women's rights. So there's that. And then on the other hand, you've got the Groypers and those people on the far right who aren't happy with that either, because they think that J.D. Vance is not one of them because of his wife, and because he has tended to embrace Project 2025. So going into this Republican National Convention, the point that I want to make there is that people got to stop talking about Trump as if he is going to win everything. This is just, aside from being completely demoralizing, it just doesn't fit the facts on the ground. And part of the reason for that is because you could fantasize whatever you wanted about who he was, because he wasn't in public and he wasn't really doing much. Now that people are seeing him and he's doing stuff again, it's going to be a hard row for the next several months for him. And one of the things that you can already see he's doing is he's trying to stay out of the limelight so that people can't pick on him for stuff. So while Biden's been out there, he's given, I think, 22 interviews in the last 2 weeks or so. Trump hasn't given any. So, he's going to try to stay out of the places where he can become an issue, where people will challenge him on stuff. So it's really important that you recognize that there are those wedges in the party, and the real problems within the party, and what's going to happen with that. Like Nick Fuentes, who's one of the heads of the Groypers, which is a far right group, said that he didn't think that his people were going to follow Trump unless he went more extreme. And who knows? People say a lot of stuff, but there's a real split going on there in the party. Okay, so that brings me to the next thing you asked about, and that was, can we trust polls? And the answer remains no. Once again, I say, if people are being polled on issues, they're pretty reliable, not 100%. But in terms of presidential polls, no, because they right now are part of a larger conversation about politics. So people try and skew those polls. Now, what's different in that is a campaign's internal polls. They don't want to be fooled. They want to know exactly what's going on. And internal polls are pretty reliable. But the kicker to those is that you and I don't have access to those, so we don't know what they're really saying. So do not sweat over polls. Polls are fairly useless at this point, although, of course, all of us want to see the internal polls. But, there's all sorts of problems with polling these days. Once again, I always remind you, if you're interested in polls and the polling process, the person to follow is Tom Bonnier. There's a couple of them, Roger Solenberg as well. Hi. But Solenberger as well, but he's a Democratic operative, so you got to take a little bit of that with a grain of salt as well. But no, there's really no point unless you just feel like your blood pressure needs a little bit of a workout to be following polls right now. All right, so that brings you to another big question that you asked, and that is, what about Project 2025? So there's a lot of talk about there's 3 things to pay attention to right now. And I'll be writing again and again about all of these things. There's Project 2025, there's Agenda 47, and there's the Republican National Platform. Okay, those three different things are these. let me start actually with the platform because that's going to be cheap and easy. The platform is what a party puts out as a way to tell people what they're going to do, what they're thinking about. And in the Republicans' case this year, the platform is really, I mean, I keep saying it's really interesting. I'm a political historian. It's all interesting to me, right? It is very basic. The original draft reads very much like Trump's bullet points kind of thing. He's going to stop World War III. That's literally one of the points. Well, thanks for that. Some of it is stuff that Biden has already accomplished. It's not very thorough at all. But I can tell you more about what's on the table for the Republicans from that. Then there's Agenda 47. Agenda 47 is on Trump's campaign website, and it's worth remembering that the Republican National Committee now belongs to Trump, essentially, because he got his daughter-in-law installed at the head of it, and one of his real loyalist, guy named Michael Whatley. The Agenda 47 is on the campaign website, and it's slightly more fleshed out. And it has extraordinary overlap with Project 2025, which is where I want to go with this. So Project 2025 is this. And I'm going to give you the long version here because everybody asks. And I'm really going to give you the long version because this is kind of my wheelhouse. So in the 1980s, the Republican Party was taking an entirely new direction under Ronald Reagan. And they wanted to prove that they really knew what they were doing. So they worked together with the Heritage Foundation, which was a right-wing think tank, and then they produced their own platform. It's going to be really important in a second. And what they did with those things was they said, this is a new direction we're going. We're going to get rid of all that idea that we've had since with the Democrats since World War II, that the government should, and I say this a million times, regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, promote infrastructure, and protect civil rights. People had agreed on that since the Democrats were on board with that in 1933. The Republicans really swing behind it, at least by the 1950s. And that's known as the liberal consensus. Liberal because it defends people individually. That is, the government will push back the forces that are trying to, abuse workers or abuse people of color or make it so that people in the state of Maine don't have electricity or any of the things that really people needed after World War II. And they'll provide a basic social safety net, for people who get injured or whatever. So members of both parties had agreed on that, and it was called the liberal consensus. It was the idea that that's how the government should work, because what that does is it protects individuals, and that once individuals are protected and have a decent standard of living, they will be able to innovate. They'll be able to move society forward. And this is going to seem really weird, but you may or may not remember, certainly if you're older, you probably will. There really was this thing when we were kids in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s that people were supposed to be innovating all the time. That if you worked in a factory and you had a good idea, you were supposed to tell your manager, because there was this faith in workers that they knew what they were doing and that they had good ideas. Comes out of World War II. And do you remember Popular Mechanics, the magazine Popular Mechanics? Everybody had Popular Mechanics. The idea was that everybody could invent stuff and everybody could think up stuff and everybody could be part of this innovative world. Well, that was the liberal consensus. The idea was to put effort into ordinary people. They would produce all this stuff and all these new ideas and all this value out of their work, and that would support people up at the top, and that basically stuff would push upward. The Reagan Revolution in the 1980s said that's crap. That by trying to encourage people at the bottom, the government, to do that, the government, has to put money into schools and has to put money into jobs programs and has to regulate business and dictate how workers should be treated, for example. So we're going to get rid of that because we don't believe that's how society works best. We think society works best by concentrating on the supply side of the economy. That is, by making sure government policies support people with money. Because those people with money, first of all, will have earned it in this ideology, and they will be much more efficient at using their money than government bureaucrats will. So by concentrating money among those people and getting rid of the regulations for workers and skimming down education and all that, it will free up more money for them to invest efficiently in the economy. And that will really expand the economy really quickly, and everybody will do a lot better. That was what was known as supply side economics. And hand in hand with that is going to be something later on called neoliberalism. And that's a real misnomer, the whole neoliberalism idea, because what they're trying to say is that we're in favor of the old form, it's somewhat complicated, form of liberalism before the liberal consensus. And what that means is that we're not going to get involved in anything at all. We're going to turn everything over to the markets, that we're just going to have free trade and basically may the best man win, essentially. All right. So when they did that, the Republicans in the I bet you're all asleep. I'm sorry, I just went all professor on you. But when they did that in the 1980s, the Heritage Foundation released a big piece of writing explaining why this was a good idea, or why they thought this was a good idea. And the Republican Party also instituted a new kind of political platform. And you can find this online, by the way. It's someplace called the American Presidency Project. And if you go to the documents and to political platforms, you will find that the 1980 Republican platform is really long, like really long. And a lot of it doesn't even make much sense, and it's not very well written, because what they were really trying to do is prove that they were wonks. They were demonstrating that they knew what they were doing. You know, they had this whole game plan out there. All right, so I just gave you that whole background because Project 2025 is an attempt to resurrect that concept. Now, Heritage has been doing these kind of plans for a long time, but this real heavy emphasis on Project 2025 in this moment is designed to imitate that earlier plan, which I believe was called Mandate for Change of 1980, in which they're saying, here's a blueprint for a new kind of Republican. All right? I hope you're with me on that. Because what 2025 is a blueprint of over 900 pages for an authoritarian figure to take over the United States of America. And this is, I think, one of the things that's very hard for people when they talk about 2025 or many of the other things happening around us, is it's so extreme we can't believe it's happening. And this is a problem for me writing about it, because it's like, really? You know, and especially, you know, one of the things that my hair is on fire about still every day is the Supreme Court's July 1st Trump versus United States decision that says that a president can commit crimes in office and get away with it, which is antithetical to everything this country has ever stood for. But if you say to people, we just created a king, they're like, yeah, let's see your tinfoil hat, you know? But it happened, and it is happening. So Project 2025, let me dissect it a little bit for you. Heritage, which was a think tank in the model that I just described, that idea of turning everything over to the markets and letting money concentrate at the top of the scale because they think that that's more efficient. And by the way, between 1981 and 2021, more than $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 0.1%. So it worked, but it wasn't actually working the way that Americans who voted for it thought it would. The argument was that money would get reinvested more efficiently than the government had done, and then everybody would do really well. But that's not what happened. The money simply moved to all the rich people, which is not a surprise, really, right? All right. So what happens is that Heritage got a new president about 2 years ago, a guy named Kevin Roberts. And he took Heritage in an entirely new direction. So it had been part of that old Reagan organization, small government, let the markets do things, get rid of the social safety net and all that. What Roberts did is he very deliberately set out to create a new kind of Heritage Foundation and a new kind of Republican Party. And to do that, he partnered with the Danube Institute in Hungary. The Danube Institute in Hungary, and mind you, Hungary is a little tiny country in the middle of Europe. And the idea that we're taking orders from Hungary right now really chaps my you-know-what. But anyway, so beautiful country, but, you know. The Danube Institute is the arm of Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban is the prime minister of Hungary. He was elected his second time. First time he was, Democratic kind of leader. He gets thrown out of office. He gets reelected, and the second time he becomes a dictator. He gets rid of the free press. He takes the previously excellent educational system, brings it all under his wing, and you can only teach the stuff that he wants you to. There are still political parties, but they don't get any media time, and they can't speak out against him. So even though there are elections, he always wins them by huge amounts. So he basically took Hungarian democracy and took it all into his own hands. And, the thriving businesses in Hungary all went to his cronies. He would say to somebody, we're going to buy you out for pennies on the dollar, or whatever the equivalent is in Hungarian money. And, you can either take that or we're just going to take it. And so the Hungarian economy is collapsing and so on. But that institute, the Danube Institute, pushes this idea, and this is so important, the idea that democracy is over. Democracy doesn't work. In its place, and the reason it doesn't work is because under a democratic system like we have in the United States, and like European countries do, and other countries as well, the central tenet of that is that everybody must be treated equally before the law. Now, there are a number of people who that Orban is speaking for, who, and he says this quite deliberately, who say that democracy destroys a nation. Because by requiring the government and the legal system to treat everybody as if they are equal, what it means is that women are equal to men under the law, and that means that they stop deferring to their husbands and their fathers. People of color are equal to white people, and that means that they stop deferring to white people. And immigrants are welcome into a country, which means that they will poison the blood, which you might have heard before. That idea is that instead of having democracy, he calls for illiberal democracy, or sometimes he calls it Christian democracy, which is not the same thing as the European political parties. So what you do if you get rid of democracy, you are explicitly saying some people are not as good as others. Some people are better than others, and they're the ones who have the right to rule. But here's the kicker. Those people must also be Christian under this ideology, and they should impose Christian nationalism on their countries. All right, so that's the ideology behind Orban and the Danube Institute. It is also the ideology behind people like Ron DeSantis in Florida. So when people say, oh, that could never happen here, take a look at Ron DeSantis in Florida, who literally took over one of the flagship Florida universities, put his own people in charge of it, tanked it. The faculty all left, the students all left, who literally said to Disney that it had to stop supporting its gay workers, LGBTQ plus workers, because he wanted them to discriminate with his Don't Say Gay bill, which was directly patterned on a Hungarian bill. So you've seen, and of course we got the extreme abortion ban in Florida as well, and in other places as well. But here I'm just trying to say these ideas are already in America and they are already being implemented. All right, so under Heritage, the guy in charge of Roberts in charge of Heritage wants to do the same thing in America. So that's the background for Project 2025. All right. And the idea is that this would be put in place by Trump or another similar figure when they are elected under their scheme in this next election. All right, so what does 2025 call for? The central piece of Project 2025 is a piece that has been talked about in America since the Reagan administration, and that is the idea that the president it's called the unitary executive theory. The president cannot be checked by either the courts or Congress, because in the three branches of government, each one can do whatever they want, right? In their three branches. Now that's ahistorical. That has never been the understanding of the presidency. Certainly George Washington admitted that he could be checked by the Congress. It has always been the case that the Congress and the courts insisted that the president had to be bound by the law. Not only is that in Project 2025, what did the Supreme Court just do? The Supreme Court just said not only that the president can't be checked by Congress or the courts, It just said the president is immune from prosecution for breaking the law. Okay, so that's your centerpiece. You've got this extraordinary president, but I'm not done yet. Once you've got this extraordinary president, the next piece, and it's actually all it's not really the introduction. There's an introduction to Project 2025, and then there's this first section that it describes the different pieces of it. All right, but in this first section that describes the different pieces, right after the idea of there being this strong executive, this strong president, the next piece of that is this concept that policy is personnel, as they say. That is, that you can say all the stuff you want to do, as Trump did in his first term, but if you have bureaucrats who are loyal to the Constitution, for example, a lot of them said no to Trump the first time around. There were a lot of things he tried to do that different people in the civil service wouldn't let him do. So before he left office the first time, Trump started something you're going to hear about called Schedule F. It doesn't matter what it's called. It's a little bit complicated. But what that meant was they were going to reclassify civil servants. And civil servants are people, about 2 million people in the United States, who do the work for the government. They're professional. They're selected by merit. They don't care who's in office. Their job is to track weather storms or figure out what's best for the fisheries, or try to make sure people don't get poisoned by bad food, or figure out the best way to get, well, this is a great one. This whole fact that they got the steel out of that channel in Baltimore. I wrote about that, and they did it so quickly. That was like 50 tons of steel that was tangled and full of hazardous waste. And our workers, along with a lot of partners, cleared that sucker in like weeks. And that was just a miracle, and it got like no attention at all. If you've ever done underwater work, it's a really big deal. And that was huge. There should have been national celebrations of that. And people are like, yeah, whatever, we can go back and forth. Really important that we could go back and forth, because the port of Baltimore is the biggest port for light trucks and cars in the United States. Anyway, I'm sorry, I just like the water stuff. Okay, so if you go back to that idea that personnel is policy, or policy is personnel, then Trump got very angry, and his supporters got very angry. His supporters in the administration, his administration got very angry in his first term, because career people would say, you can't do that. And so right before the end of his term, he said he was going to reschedule them all from their position as civil servants, who couldn't be fired for political reasons, which means you're a civil servant, and reclassify them as something called Schedule F, which would say they are political people and they can and will be fired upon a new person taking office. So what does that mean? That means that Trump wants to gut that nonpartisan civil service and replace it with loyalists, people who will say, whatever you say, boss, we'll do it your way. Now, think about all the places in which Trump got stymied last time around by people saying, I can't do it. That's not the way my job works. He tried to take over the Voice of America and did, in fact, put some people in there. There was pushback against that. Now he's talking about turning it into a propaganda machine. Voice of America is actually really excellent journalism. National Oceanic the people who study our oceans and our weather, all those people are civil servants, right? So he's talking about getting rid of all those people and replacing them with his cronies. And that's never a good idea, because they are not capable of doing the jobs if they're being hired for loyalty. Think Chad Wolf, for example, in Department of Homeland Security, who was illegally appointed during Trump's term. That's a given. That's not just Trump. This is one of the reasons you want people hired by quality and by merit rather than by loyalty, because they're better, right, across the board. So first of all, he wants to get rid of all those civil servants, which we've had since 1883. That's when our system began being nonpartisan civil service. He wants to get rid of that and make those people all loyalists. So all those 2 million people will do what he tells them to do without saying, hey, boss, that's kind of illegal. We're not going to do that. But that's okay, because the military will step in, right? No. because part of Project 2025 is to make the military loyal to him as well. And that's, you can see this all the time. Both he and Tucker Carlson used to complain bitterly about Mark Milley, Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, because he came out after the June 1st, 2020 march on Lafayette Square and said, we are not going to be loyal to a man. We are loyal to the Constitution. And after that, every branch of the military said the same thing. Trump has said he wants to get rid of all those people and replace them with loyalists. So now you have both the civil servants and the military answering to Trump. But that's okay, you have the courts, right? Oh, wait. He also wants to do the same thing with the Department of Justice so that it will prosecute the people he thinks are disloyal to him and defend people like him. He's already said he wants to get rid of the Department of Justice's, all of its cases against him, despite the fact that his breach of national security with the retention of those documents is the most significant breach of American intelligence, which is designed to keep us safe, as we have had in our entire history. I cannot tell you how upset I am about that breach. And one of the things that happened yesterday when Eileen Cannon, U.S. District Judge in Florida, dismissed that case, which is being appealed, was that I went back over my earlier letters about what had happened. And I was really shocked at just how bad it was and how much we've normalized it. Because when we first learned just about 2 years ago that Trump had retained all those documents, we learned it in August of 2022, our hair was on fire. And then we saw the pictures of the stage and the bathroom. And then we thought, where is this stuff gone? And then it turned out there was more stuff that was missing. And now we know there's more stuff that we still don't have. And that stuff got moved to his place in New Jersey and that there was a secret room in Mar-a-Lago. That's stuff that people have given their lives to produce for our intelligence agencies so that we know where the threats against the United States of America are coming from. And once again, that is the primary duty of a government, is to keep its people safe. He pissed that away, gave it away, sold it, who knows? And it's you and me who are in danger because of that. And he's saying, I had the right to do that. I'm not okay. I'm really not okay with that. You can tell. All right, I'll try and bring this down. So now you've got all those things, all those groups loyal to him. All the guardrails are now supposed to be loyal to him under Project 2025. What are they going to do with that power? Well, one of the things about Project 2025 is it's over 900 pages long. It's written by a lot of different people, so there's some contradictions in it. And that's what you often see, is people saying, oh, that's not in there. Look at this sentence. But just because it's not in that sentence doesn't mean it's not somewhere else. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of that in a minute. But what Project 2025 does is it imposes that government that the leader of the Heritage Foundation, which was the primary author of Project 2025, admired in the Danube Institute and in Viktor Orban's Hungary. It imposes the idea of Christian nationalism on the United States of America. And that starts with what they call the protection of the family. I mean, who doesn't want to protect the family, right? That sounds like it's so, sliced bread, right? You want to protect the family. That's not what they mean. By protecting the family, they mean reinstating the idea of a patriarchal Christian version of society in which there is not, for example, abortion. That's one of the things that they believe destroys society. Certainly LGBTQ plus people, out of luck. They're not part of the American family. That is, they think, bad. That's not the word they use. What about book banning? What about what we are able to read? Anything that impinges on that version of the family, they consider pornography. And they are literally calling librarians pornographers and saying that people who disperse pornography should be jailed. And their version of pornography is things that reflect, for example, LGBTQ plus people, saying that you are, representing sexual minorities, gender minorities, non-traditional families, is dangerous to society. So you can go down this list and see where this is going to lead. But what they are talking about doing is imposing that kind of Christianity that Orban has imposed in Hungary, which of course cuts out all religious minorities or religious groups in America that are not Christian. But interestingly enough, there are real fights among Christians about what Christianity is. So that is a fight that was exactly weirdly behind the idea of establishing in the United States of America that the law was going to determine our relations with each other rather than religion. Because literally in old Europe, people were having wars over different kinds of Christianity. You didn't have to get into different religions. So that's the larger picture behind Project 2025. Specifics. You're seeing in some places, and I'll do a longer rundown on this at some point, you're seeing in places that people who are talking about Project 2025 are getting fact-checked. And the one that you are most often fact-checked on is the idea that it calls for a national abortion ban. And this is, again, a misreading of the document in that it does call for a national abortion ban, but the language of it is careful. That is, in Project 2025, it says that part of protecting the family is protecting the rights of babies from the beginning. What that is a reference to is something called fetal personhood. And what fetal personhood means is that from the second sperm meets an egg, that fertilized egg has all the same rights as a human being, a fully fledged human being. So under that idea of fetal personhood, what that does is that would get rid of all abortion, of course, under any circumstances. It would get rid of IVF, in vitro fertilization. It would get rid of a number of different kinds of contraception. But it also raises all these questions about what happens if you have a miscarriage. Can you be blamed for having a miscarriage? How do you prove it to people? I mean, basically, you'd have to be monitored, right? So people would know if you had caused harm to this other human being. And that's a really big deal. But it doesn't actually stop there, because the idea of fetal personhood laws is bonkers. I mean, there's this argument, I read a lot up on this the other day. There's this argument that this is the way people thought about fetuses until very recently. It's just not. I mean, that's just completely wrong. And if you care, I can tell you linguistically how they got there. But the idea of fetal personhood starts to be talked about in the United States in the 1960s. Okay, that's the first you're going to hear about it for many reasons. Someday I'll do one of these things on fetal development and how it's been thought of historically. Not today. But it's a fringe idea. It's a totally fringe idea. It starts to get out of the fringes in 2008. All right, so this is a really new theory. But here's the kicker to it. If, in fact, that blastocyst is a human being, they want to protect its rights to the due process of the laws and to the equal protection of the laws, right? That should sound familiar because that's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution that was added to the Constitution in 1868. And the kicker to that is that if you know your 14th Amendment, which I hope everybody does. It's my favorite amendment. I know you all have your own. The thing about the 14th Amendment is it is the second amendment to the United States Constitution that increases rather than decreases the power of the federal government. The 13th Amendment does, and the 14th Amendment does, so does the 15th. And what that means is that if you are protecting that fertilized egg under the 14th Amendment, you can also call on the final piece of the 14th Amendment, which says Congress shall have the power with appropriate legislation to enforce this amendment. So what that says is if you're protecting that fertilized egg under the 14th Amendment, as fetal personhood laws do, that the National Congress has the power to do that. That's a national abortion ban. All right. They didn't say we want a national abortion ban. What they said is we're going to put this in the kind of language that we hope will fly under the radar screen, but that the people who want a national abortion ban will understand as we understand it. And that's exactly what happens. So immediately Susan B. Anthony pro-life something list, said this is exactly what's going on. And lest you think that couldn't happen, there is a right-wing Congress critter who has already introduced that idea into legislation in Congress in 2023. That idea with sponsors was introduced into Congress. Didn't pass, but it was, or at least I don't think it passed. It would never have gotten through the Senate. But this is not somebody sitting in a closet somewhere with a tinfoil hat saying this is in this document. It is in the document. And it is in the document in this very clear way for anybody who's paying deep attention to the way this stuff plays out. And you know what? I went on too long on that because I also wanted to talk about some of the other stuff in it, but I'm already over time. I'm sorry. So let me end with a couple of other things. The first is people have asked how to get their children involved in the fight this year. Listen, everybody's overwhelmed. We're all exhausted. I would suggest that rather than playing to people's fears, we do what I've been calling for now for a few weeks. Recognize, and this speaks to the other point that I wanted to make, and that's that that this is not about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, by the way, is hugely supported by the Heritage Institute and by that guy I was just telling you about. J.D. Vance will put all this in place. Trump is probably not going a real threat in terms of getting stuff done. J.D. Vance would be. But one of the things about this moment is that lots of people are really afraid. And this is one of the things I was trying to call out when I talked about the Republican Party. This says I have a little more time, actually. The Republican Party is badly divided. And what it is talking about imposing on the United States is really unpopular. People don't like this. We want our kids to have decent educations. We want them to have access to the kinds of ideas that librarians, who are trained, by the way, they don't just walk off the street and say, oh, this looks like a good book for a kid. They are trained to know what is age appropriate for kids. And they love what they do, and they love children as well. People want their kids to get good educations, They want to have the ability to plan their families. They want the ability to have abortion care for complications, for family planning, for whatever they need their doctors to be there for, between them and their doctors, without having a politician saying, no, you can't make those kinds of decisions. They want common sense gun safety legislation. More than 80% of Americans want common sense gun safety legislation. Those are things that are enormously popular. So when you talk about involving children or young people in, I'm sorry, I'm real tired. It's been quite a day. Young people in politics, certainly we should be afraid of things like Project 2025, but it's not, again, this is not about Trump. This is about us saying, come on, folks. We're really tired of a Supreme Court that's dictating to us. We're really tired of, the president stealing documents. We're really tired of the idea that you think you get to decide whether or not I terminate a pregnancy that is not viable. We're really tired of watching our children afraid of getting gunned down in their schools. It's the time for us to celebrate who we are as Americans and say, this is the America we want. So how do you do that? You do that, first of all, by making friends with people, by turning out in groups, by working to get people out to the vote, but also just to talk to people, to say, hey, come over, let's chat about this. Let's go gardening. Let's bring our best game every single day, because we're not just talking about voting. We're talking about overriding Trump's vision of America as a hellscape, an American carnage. I don't know about you. I've been traveling all over this country for more than 6 months. It's not a hellscape. People are great. Do we have problems? Sure. We've always had problems. That's the definition of history. But what we do have in this moment is a lot of energized people to deal with those problems. We also have this very small minority that is trying to corral us all to say, we don't want people of color to have voices. We don't want women to have voices. We want you all to do what we tell you. Well, this is the moment when we say, thanks very much, but we are demanding an equal say in our government, and we are demanding the right to be treated equally before the laws. And that's really what this moment is about. So in terms of including younger people, sure, tell them about things like I just told you, the fact that fetal personhood is an attack on any kind of control over somebody's reproductive health, because of the notion that that fertilized egg has all the rights that the person carrying that fertilized egg does. And, you can play that out in your own head. Certainly people should be afraid, but also they have the ability to change this. They have the ability to go to work for things they care about. They don't have to be political things. They could be caring about anything in the community that will make them put their shoulder to the wheel and feel like they are partly carrying this country the same way so many of us are trying to do. So the thing I'd like to leave you with is, once again, the recognition that nobody should be treating Donald Trump as if he is inevitable, not because I'm inviting you to whistle through the dark, but rather because his campaign is a mess. The Republican National Committee is a mess. He's a mess. And there are all these people who are looking at America today and saying, we don't want to give this country up to people like him. We don't want to give this country up to Stephen Miller. We don't want to give this country up to Steve Bannon. We want the laws to treat everybody equally. We want to have a say in our government. And you know what? We're on the right side of history. We're the people who are echoing Abraham Lincoln. We're the people who are echoing the civil rights movement. We're the people who are standing firmly for American democracy the same way our heroines and heroes have done throughout our history. So one of the things I'd really encourage you to do is, sure, be afraid of what people like J.D. Vance will impose on us given the opportunity. But don't cower under your beds, because the whole reason they are being so aggressive, the whole reason that people are on the right are calling for violence. People on the left aren't calling for violence. People on the right are calling for violence. The whole reason they're doing that is because they have to cow the vast numbers of us who don't want what they want into submission. Because if we show up, and if we vote, and if we get people out to vote, and if we turn this ship of state along the lines that people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have outlined in the last almost 4 years now, we have an entirely new future, and it's an exciting future. It will be an incredible thing to be part of. And remember that when you're going out there, because this isn't a funeral. This is still a party, and it's a party, and I don't mean a political party. It's a celebration of America and of American democracy. And the numbers on our side are huge. So we need to recognize that, we need to reach for that, and we need to include people in this revisioning of the United States of America going into this election. You can do it through social media. You can do it through community groups. You can do it, play to whatever your strengths are, but get out there and do what it takes to make people feel like it's their country again. And young people will be part of that, but so also will older people. And in this election, for the first time in a long time, older people are breaking heavily for the Democrats, in part because we would like to leave for our children and grandchildren the same kind of country that we inherited. And I really feel like in many ways, this election is up to us to do exactly that. So I didn't get to everything because I did some deep dives. Sorry about that. But thank you for being here. And like I say, don't despair, and don't pay too much attention to what all the politicians are doing. The politicians matter for sure, and you should all have your favorite politician and all that. But remember, a lot of what they are saying and doing right now is jockeying to get elected by their particular constituents. They're thinking in very specific ways. I'm not thinking in specific ways. We are thinking as a country, and that matters a lot now too. Get involved at the local level, get involved at the state level, get involved at the national level. But remember that if somebody says something that pisses you off, don't worry about it. because this is not an election about individuals. This is an election about us and what we want for this country. And I'm thinking it's looking pretty good. So long as we all turn out and we make sure people can get to the polls, we make sure our voices are heard. All right, I am freaking hot here, and I've been going all day. So I'm going to turn this off and I'm going to go jump in the harbor. Thanks for being here. The first that really seemed to be jumping out to people was the issue of Iran and whether or not the United States is going to go to war with Iran. And I'm going to talk today primarily about larger principles in terms of how one observes politics. So the first thing I would say to you, always, it is a given that the first place you always look when one country attacks another is at the country that's doing the attacking. Because people, at least in the United States, which is the only thing I have any experience with, often make the mistake of seeing countries, especially other countries, as monoliths. And they never, ever, ever are. Even if they are an authoritarian country, even if it seems like one group has all the power, there is always a political contest going on in a country. So whenever you see Russia invade Ukraine, for example, or, one country trying to go after another country, it's you have to start with what's going on internally to that country. So that's the first thing I would say when you look at this larger issue here. But also, if the United States ends up getting involved somewhere else, as it has done in the past, what is going on internally in that country? Now, I'm not going to talk about Israeli politics, about which I know only as much as anybody on the street does. But that's a really important thing to remember if you think about what's happening right now between Israel and Iran. So let me just give you a little bit of the background. And remember that all of the countries involved have very long histories in the past, and that there are a number of countries, not just Israel and not just the United States, who don't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. So that's hanging out there. There's a lot of people who've been trying to stop that from happening for a long time. And if you remember, in 2015, President Barack Obama managed to negotiate what was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. Just by the way, I have to look up all these acronyms every time too. So if you're like, crap, what is that again? Don't feel like you're not in really good company. They keep throwing acronyms at us all the time. And who knows? But anyway, if you see JCPOA, that's the nuclear deal. That's the Iran deal. You hear about the Iran nuclear deal, and it stands for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And what that said was that the US, China, France, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom would lift economic sanctions that they had against Iran in exchange for limits to Iran's nuclear program. Now, when even at the time that was negotiated, if you remember, there were a number of Republicans in Congress, led actually by Tom Cotton, who was a junior senator at the time, were like, they actually wrote an open letter to Iran saying, don't bother to negotiate with Obama, because the second we get back in power, we're going to tear this deal up. That is, in fact, what happened when Trump was elected and then took office in 2017. In 2018, he pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, out of the Iran nuclear deal. And he said he was going to negotiate a better deal. Now, it's worth remembering that this is kind of an MO of Trump's. He tears something up, and then he basically tries to renegotiate what was already there and then put his own name on it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. More often doesn't than does. But he said, he was going to renegotiate and get a better deal. Well, what he did was he put onto Iran what he called a maximum pressure campaign to get it to agree to another version of a sort of joint comprehensive nuclear deal. And in fact, that didn't work. So now that he is back in power, in February of 2025, he reinstituted the plan of maximum pressure to try and force the Iranians to a deal. But also, that was February. And then in March, his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said that the American intelligence community assessed that Iran was not, in fact, close to developing a nuclear weapon. Just hold that out there. Also in March then, Trump sort of changed his tune. He actually said to the Fox News channel that he had sent a letter to the supreme leader in Iran saying that that they should start to negotiate, because nobody, if the U.S. had to come down on them militarily, it wasn't going to end well for them. And the Iranians began by saying, stop it. We're not going to give in to your pressure. But by April, they said, yes, they were willing to talk. Now, again, when I said you got to think about sort of all the different players here, remember that Iran had backed those non-state actors I keep talking about in Lebanon, Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza. And they had been badly, badly hurt, those different non-state actors. Hamas had been hammered since the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel. Israel had also been hammering Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the U.S. especially had been hitting the Houthis in Yemen. So all of their proxies were significantly weaker. And by April, they suggested that, in fact, they were willing to talk. So discussions began in April, and there have actually been 5 sets of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran taking place in places like Oman. And they haven't agreed to anything, but they're talking, that sort of thing going on. And that's where things stood last week, when there was to be yet another meeting in Oman on Sunday, I think it was the 15th of June. There was supposed to be another meeting when they were going to keep negotiating, the U.S. and Iran, and negotiators were supposed to be working on this issue. But in all of this, the United States had largely cut out Israel's Netanyahu. Now, remember, again, Israel's got a number of political parties. Netanyahu has just gone through a vote that looked pretty dicey. There's a lot going on in Israel as well. Again, I'm not going to get into that, but remember, these are not, this is one of the things about politics that is really interesting, but also somewhat maddening, is that it's constantly a moving target. People are changing all the time, and positions are changing all the time. So, it always sort of frustrates me when someone says, well, you believed that 25 years ago. It's like, well, it was a whole different world then. So anyway, Israel had been had been cut out of these discussions. And on June 12th, which was last Thursday, Netanyahu's government struck Iran, hitting nuclear facilities and senior military officials, killing a bunch of them. And this is this is where the U.S. now I'm turning back to the U.S., and I hope this is useful. I know it's a lot of moving pieces, but so what happened, if you think about it, that night, I remember because I was writing and I had just written a whole letter, and then that happened, and I'm like, really? Come on. The U.S. Secretary of State, who is Marco Rubio, the former Florida senator, issued a statement in which he said the U.S. had nothing to do with this. Israel acted unilaterally, and Iran should not hit American military personnel. Remember, though, that Rubio is also the acting national security advisor. Because remember, the first national security advisor was Brian Waltz, and he's the guy who invited the Atlantic journalist onto the Signal chat where they were planning military strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. And so Trump just said, we're not going to do that again. We'll just get Rubio to cover the national security advisor role as well. So when Rubio came into that particular office, he's acting, by the way, he's not confirmed. When he came into that, he got rid of a lot of people in the National Security Council. So the White House is operating with virtually no, maybe not even virtually no, national security people or military crisis people in this moment. They don't really have anybody. The people that they have got are Rubio, who's filling both of these roles, plus Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who has really no experience at all in this, and Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. And though they have both been sidelined, according to the Washington Post, and Trump is sort of saying he's going to handle all this on his own. And we know that Trump basically keeps insisting he's the world's best negotiator. He recently said he could have negotiated the way out of the Civil War. But the reality is, if he was a good negotiator and it looked like things were going in a good direction, Netanyahu would not have struck Iran. He didn't strike Iran under Biden, and he didn't do it under Trump the first time when Trump had some adults in the room. Now he feels like he's got the leeway to do that. All right. So Rubio comes out and he says, we had nothing to do with this. However, in the very early days of the strikes, they looked pretty successful. Now, Iran's been striking back with missiles, but at the beginning of the days, it looked like it was a really good, hit, and it was going to be a victory. And all of a sudden, Trump started posting on social media that the U.S. seemed to be involved. He began to take credit for the strike, saying it was American hardware that had done them, and insisting that Iran would make a deal. And then that was Friday. And then on Saturday, of course, were the No Kings protests, which were huge, about 2% of the U.S. population, and his military parade, which really fizzled, which, by the way, was kind of sad as an American. The idea of showcasing American eras of military was actually pretty cool. They only had 2 months to do it, and it looked like it was his birthday party, and he didn't disabuse anybody of that idea. And I'm just kind of giving a shout out here to the soldiers and sailors who worked on that. So that happened Saturday, right? So, and I'm trying to build up a picture here, obviously. But there is an important piece here, and that is that the United States is the only military that has a bomb that can get deep enough underground to actually hit the places where Iran appears to be developing nuclear capabilities, if indeed it is doing so. And so there's pressure on the U.S. to produce the one kind of plane that can carry this bomb, which is 30,000 pounds. It's called a massive ordnance penetrator, to deliver it to Iran. So there's pressure on the U.S. to participate on the side of Israel. All right. So Trump, when he was at the G7 in Canada, kept sort of pressing the idea that maybe the U.S. was going to get involved. And, he keeps saying Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And then sort of out of the blue, he says, everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. More than 9 million people live in Tehran, and more than 16 million live in the immediate area. That's I think it's a little bit bigger, actually, than the state of Pennsylvania. It's like saying to the state of Pennsylvania, everybody out. I mean, it was just a weird thing to say. And then he left the G7, and when France's Emmanuel Macron said he's gone to negotiate a ceasefire, he kind of exploded on social media and says, no, I'm doing something much bigger than that. He's got it wrong. Stay tuned. And then he started to say, we have control over the air in Iran, and we know exactly where the supreme leader is hiding. We're not going to kill him right now, but we know where he is. Again, suggesting that the U.S. was involved. It certainly seemed as if he kind of wanted a quick win, and it was kind of, I'm going to stamp the Americans on this because it looks like it's going to win. But then it became really clear really quickly. And again, we're talking, this is all happening in a week. This is a week of time. A week ago at this time, if you look back at the tape I did, I wasn't talking about this. But then MAGA, his supporters, split very badly over this, because there are the isolationists who don't want America involved in foreign wars at all. Remember, we've been pulling out of everything right and left because America first, and we're going to be isolated. And that's people like Steve Bannon, for example, and Tucker Carlson, both media people who insist that the U.S. should not be involved anywhere. And on the other hand, in the MAGA movement, you have the evangelicals who believe that Israel is central to the second coming of Jesus Christ before the end days. And they believe that America should always intervene on the side of Israel. And they're represented by people like the American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, who messaged Trump, at least Trump put something that purported to be a message from him on True Social, basically urging Trump to use missiles, including the potential for nuclear missiles on Iran. It was really kind of an astonishing statement. So MAGA started to split over this, and they're really, really at each other's throats over this. At the same time, Iran started to hit back. And it became clear that this was not going to be a one and done. And yet at the same time, the news has kept the focus entirely on Trump. So one of the things, so Trump loves this. He's center of attention again, and nobody's talking about the parade, and nobody's talking about the No Kings protest. And all of a sudden, the whole world is waiting on Donald Trump again. So he's loving it. But there's really not very much he can do that isn't going to upset somebody and put him in a bad position. So what he has done is he's repeatedly said, I get to decide. I'm the one, you don't know what I'm going to do. I might do it, I might not, and kept the cameras on himself. And yet today he had Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, come out with a statement in which he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll let you know within the next 2 weeks, which suggests he's probably hoping to kick the can down the road and hope that the problem will go away, because there is no way he can split that baby that is going to keep MAGA together. And as soon as a war breaks out, as soon as America gets involved in a war, he's not going to be the center of attention anymore. The war will be the center of attention, and people aren't going to like it. Americans are very, very, very tired of wars in the Middle East.